Camp Ruston, Louisiana, December 1944. The sky was pale, the barracks colder than usual. Inside the mess hall, spoons clinked quietly against metal trays. Then, without warning, a low crackle rose from the overhead speaker. At first, just static. Then a sound none of the women had ever heard. A saxophone, slow, golden, seductive. A rhythm unlike anything from home. Every German POW froze. One woman stood up, mouth parted. Another whispered, "Was ist das für Musik?" No one answered. But every heartbeat in that room shifted because something foreign had just walked into their souls. Before the war, Frieda Becker measured life in threads and fabric. She'd spent her days in a narrow shop in Hamburg, hemming sleeves and sewing linings, her fingers calloused but nimble, her world small and predictable. When the Reich called her up in 1943, she didn't resist. Women were needed behind the lines, clerks, drivers, cooks. She had no desire for glory, just survival. But even that was a fragile thing. Captured in Italy while moving rations, she was marched, processed, and eventually packed onto a ship to a place she had never imagined America. The journey was long and quiet, the air thick with fear and confusion. The sea stretched endlessly. When she stepped off in Louisiana, it wasn't the land that startled her, but the sky open and blue like a storybook. Camp Ruston looked more like a school than a prison, with its flat wooden buildings and wide dirt paths. The guards weren't cruel, just watchful. No beatings, no shouting, just rules. Frieda kept her head down, followed them all. She learned to say yes and thank you in English. She ate the food they gave, strange but filling, canned meat, white bread, sweet coffee. Time passed in muted repetition. She made her bunk each morning, mended shirts when asked, listened to the wind. The other women were quiet too, though sometimes at night she heard them cry. Some had lost brothers, others had buried lovers in frozen Russian soil. No one spoke of politics, no one spoke of Hitler. In this place, silence was safer. Frieda had grown used to that silence, wrapped herself in it like a coat. Until that one afternoon in December, when music broke it wide open, when that first note played through the speaker, her spoon stopped midair. It was not German, it was not classical, it was alive. And she hated how much her heart leaned toward it. The saxophone rose and fell like a voice with no words, and she felt her skin prickle. Not from cold, from recognition, or maybe longing, or both. She looked around, but the other women were just as stunned. No one dared speak. Some looked angry, others confused, but Frieda just stared at the speaker in the ceiling, like it had just whispered her name. In that moment, she wasn't in camp anymore. She wasn't a prisoner. She was something else entirely awake. The heat was strange that winter. Not the bitter kind Frieda knew from Germany, but a damp heaviness that clung to everything. The Louisiana air felt like it had secrets, like it was watching. The camp wasn't cruel, but it was not kind either. It was limbo caught between war and peace, guilt and numbness. The guards were young, mostly Southern boys, their accents thick as molasses, and their eyes darting with curiosity. They didn't know what to make of the German women, and the women didn't know what to make of the guards. Frieda watched them from the corner of her eye, how they shifted nervously when handing out food, how they avoided direct conversation, how some blushed when spoken to. Back home, she'd been warned that Americans were monsters. But these guards looked like farm boys dressed up in two big uniforms, unsure if they were captors or caretakers. The local townsfolk were no better prepared. When they found out Camp Ruston was receiving German women instead of men, the reaction was one of confusion, suspicion, and something else fear laced with fascination. Word spread quickly. German girls were being housed just miles from town. Some folks wanted them gone. Others drove past slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse through the fence. Once, a woman from the church dropped off, donated blankets and Bibles. She stared at them like they were ghosts. No one spoke to her. She didn't come back. The camp routines dulled the senses. Wake, eat, sit, clean, sleep, rinse, repeat. Frieda found herself memorizing the cracks in the ceiling of her bunk. She learned which floorboards creaked near the latrine. She noticed which women had started whispering at night and which ones just stared blankly into nothing. The Red Cross came once a month, their presence brief and perfunctory. They asked questions no one dared answer honestly. Do you feel safe? Do you need medical care? Are you treated well? Frieda nodded each time, lips pressed tightly shut. Truth had long ago stopped feeling safe. The strangest part was how little hatred there was in the air. After all, they'd been through the propaganda, the loss, the war. Frieda had expected rage, but instead there was mostly silence, and underneath it, exhaustion. The women were tired of being tools, of being watched, of carrying a flag they no longer believed in. They were not heroes, they were not victims, they were survivors, unsure what they were surviving for. At night, Frieda sometimes touched the small embroidered handkerchief she kept hidden beneath her pillow. It was the last thing she owned from home. She'd stitched it herself, back when she believed her hands would always be used for creation. Now, they just folded sheets and washed trays. She missed music, she missed colors, she missed not being afraid, but most of all, she missed the sound of her own laughter. In Camp Ruston, even joy felt like a foreign language. The mess hall at Camp Ruston was the kind of place where sound went to die. Long wooden tables lined the room, their surfaces stained with spilled coffee and silent meals. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow that made every face look more tired than it already was. There were no songs, no laughter, just the slow shuffle of boots on concrete and the dull scrape of utensils against metal trays. The food was always the same: white bread, gray meat, overcooked vegetables that had long since forgotten what flavor tasted like. Sometimes the coffee was warm, sometimes not. No one complained. What was the point? Frieda sat with the same group of women each day, though they barely spoke. Sometimes a nod, sometimes a muttered, "Pass the salt." But mostly they just stared forward, each woman lost in a private war inside her own head. It had been months since Frieda had heard anything that resembled music. Even birdsong seemed to avoid this place. Back home, the streets had carried the rhythm of the city trams clattering, heels on pavement, the occasional piano leaking through a cracked window. Here, everything was flat. Even the wind seemed afraid to move too loudly. Then, one afternoon, something unusual happened. A soldier walked in with a cardboard box under one arm. He was tall, maybe in his early 20s, with freckles scattered across his cheeks and a nervous energy that made him look younger than he probably was. He set the box down near the corner of the room and pulled out something old and familiar, at least to him. A record player. It looked battered but functional, its brass arm scratched and worn from use. The soldier cleared his throat and smiled awkwardly. "You girls ever heard jazz?" he asked, holding up a black vinyl record. A few women glanced at each other in confusion. One woman snorted under her breath. Frieda didn't move. She didn't know the word, but she knew the tone, playful, almost mischievous. The soldier placed the needle on the record. A soft crackle filled the room. Then, music. It didn't come gently. It swaggered in bold, brassy, alive. The horns leapt, the drums strutted, the piano danced. Frieda felt her whole body tense. This wasn't background noise. This music demanded to be heard. It didn't ask for permission. Around her, forks stopped midair. A woman, 2 seats down, lowered her bread slowly. Another blinked hard, as if trying to wake up from a dream. One woman stood up and walked out without a word. Frieda just stared at the spinning record. The music didn't sound like war. It sounded like something else. Something dangerous, maybe, or free. Either way, it was louder than anything silence could contain. The record spun with a soft hiss, the kind of sound that felt alive in a room so used to being dead. Then the first true note rang out, a low, golden swell from a saxophone, deep and slow, as if it had been waiting decades just to be heard by them. Frieda's breath caught in her throat. It didn't sound like anything she had ever known. Not marches, not lullabies, not the sterile orchestras of state broadcasts. This was something else. The melody didn't march, it moved. It swayed and pulled, like smoke curling through the air. It was unashamed, loose, and full of something she couldn't name. The others were just as stunned. You could see it in the way they sat, hands still, hovering above plates, eyes darting toward the speaker, as if unsure whether to be afraid or offended. Some stared with thinly veiled suspicion, others with a quiet awe. One woman near the end of the table put her head down like she was praying. Another tightened her jaw, muttered something under her breath, and pushed her tray away. Frieda just sat there, her heart pounding, unsure why a simple song made her feel like she had just been exposed. The saxophone gave way to a rolling piano, light and dancing, chased by a snap of drums that felt more like a heartbeat than percussion. It was Duke Ellington, though none of the women knew the name. What they did know was that something forbidden had just entered the room. The Reich had called this music degenerate, decadent, impure, poisoned by foreign rhythms and the wrong kinds of people. In Germany, this song would have been illegal, but here, it was playing freely in a mess hall full of enemy prisoners, and no one stopped it. Frieda felt her fingers twitch on the edge of her tray, not quite tapping, not yet, just a flicker of motion, like her body was waking up without permission. It terrified her. She glanced around to make sure no one had noticed, but they were all still frozen in their own confusion. The song shifted again, diving into a rhythm that made no logical sense, yet still held together like a dream you didn't want to leave. By the time the record ended, the room was silent again. No clapping, no sighs, just the sound of spoons returning cautiously to trays. One of the guards shrugged and took the record off. Another soldier said something about playing a different one tomorrow, and the women began to rise, unsure if they'd just been entertained or invaded. Frieda stood slowly. She didn't speak. But as she walked back to her barracks, the melody followed her like a shadow, curling into the corners of her mind and refusing to let go. They played it again the next day. Not the same song, but something cut from the same strange fabric. This one had a faster tempo, a clarinet that danced instead of walked, a trumpet that seemed to laugh. It was louder, somehow, not in volume, but in feeling, as if the music itself had grown confident overnight. This time, fewer women left the hall. Most stayed seated, still stiff, but with eyes fixed on the speaker. Some arms remained crossed, but others rested open on laps. Frieda sat straighter than usual, pretending to ignore the music while secretly listening to every note. The guards didn't say much. They leaned on the walls or sat behind the women, sipping from tin mugs. One of them, a curly-haired boy with a southern drawl, tapped his boot in time with the rhythm. It didn't feel like taunting. It felt normal, like he'd grown up with this sound and never once imagined it could stop a room cold. Frieda envied that, to live without fearing music, without questioning if the art you loved might get you labeled an enemy. That night, Frieda couldn't sleep. The tune looped through her head, not as melody, but as motion. Her fingers kept twitching against the thin blanket, as though her hands were trying to play along with an invisible piano. She didn't know the names of the songs, or the people who played them, but the feeling that she understood, there was something defiant in it, something that made rules feel like paper walls. And for a woman who had spent years obeying, that was dangerous. The next afternoon, the record was Ella Fitzgerald, a voice like velvet and thunder, playful and aching all at once. The lyrics were in English, but the emotion needed no translation. The women sat quietly, listening without pretending to ignore it now. One even smiled. Another leaned slightly forward, as if drawn physically toward the sound. Clara, the former stage dancer from Dresden, let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and whispered, "That's a woman who knows sorrow." Frieda's reaction was quieter. She didn't smile, she didn't sigh, but something opened inside her, a crack in the concrete. It scared her how quickly the music had done what months of captivity could not. It made her feel again. That was not part of the plan. She had promised herself not to feel, not until the war ended, not until she knew who had survived and who hadn't. But here was this jazz, forcing its way into her silence, unapologetic and warm. She tried to resist it, but every time she did, her heart betrayed her. because somewhere between the drums and the brass and that impossible voice, Frieda had begun to remember who she was before all of this, and that, she feared, might be the first step toward becoming someone new. Back in Germany, jazz had been treated like a virus. It was black music, Jewish music, American music, and therefore unclean. The Reich had outlawed it under the banner of purity, lumping it together with cabaret filth, experimental painting, and any art that didn't march in time. Propaganda posters showed jittery silhouettes dancing under crooked notes, warning young girls that even a single listen could unravel their moral spine. Frieda remembered the leaflets. She remembered the words, entartate music, degenerate music. She'd never questioned it. Not then. Why would she? The world around her had already decided what was right and what was rot. She had grown up on strict melodies, school choirs, national anthems, folk tunes about rivers and duty, songs with clean rhythms and clear purpose. Nothing that swayed, nothing that surprised. That kind of control had comforted her, even as a child. It made life feel ordered, predictable, safe. But now, here she was, in a foreign land, surrounded by foreign gods, and the only thing that didn't feel like a threat was the very music she had been taught to fear. The irony clawed at her. She thought of the men who'd vanished her cousin Ernst, lost outside Stalingrad. Her father, imprisoned for questioning too much, too early. She wondered if either of them had ever heard jazz. She wondered if they would have hated it. Or if they, too, would have found something in the rhythm that felt like breath. The next record played without ceremony. Louis Armstrong. His trumpet tore through the quiet like a grin with teeth. And then came the voice, gravelly, playful, filled with light and sorrow in the same breath. Frieda couldn't understand the lyrics, but she understood the story. It was all there in the way he bent each note, in the pauses that said more than the phrases that followed. It wasn't just music, it was memory being sung out loud. Clara sat beside her and whispered, "They banned this back home, said it would rot our minds." She smirked without humor. Maybe our minds needed rotting. Frieda didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, and her eyes burned for reasons she refused to examine. All she knew was that the things she'd believed were slipping from her hands like dust. Not because someone had shouted at her, not because anyone had forced her, but because this music, without permission, had entered the empty space where her certainty used to live. That night, she didn't dream of home. She didn't dream of trains or uniforms or flags. She dreamed of brass horns and trembling piano keys, of shadowed rooms filled with people swaying not in fear, but in rhythm. And when she woke, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like someone who had survived the collapse of something false and was now quietly learning how to breathe again. The song that finally broke her was one she never knew the name of. It started with a slow piano, delicate and aching, like someone was searching for the right words and couldn't find them. Then came the voice, soft, low, and full of shadows. A woman singing in English, though Frieda couldn't make out every phrase. Still, the meaning was clear. It was a love song, but not the kind sung with open arms. It was a song of missing someone so much it hurt to breathe. The kind of missing that builds inside your ribs and never fully leaves. She sat in the mess hall with her hands folded in her lap, the uneaten bread on her tray growing stale. Around her, the usual stillness had settled again. A few women watched the speaker with blank eyes. Others stared at their food, pretending not to listen. But Frieda felt every word like a thread, pulling at something deep beneath the surface. The voice didn't just carry notes, it carried longing, and for the first time since she arrived in the camp, Frieda felt her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She didn't cry right away. The tears built slowly, like water behind a dam, pressure rising with every line. She tried to blink them away, tried to breathe evenly, keep her hands steady. But when the chorus returned and the singer whispered, "I'll be seeing you," something inside her cracked. The image of her brother flashed in her mind, his laugh, his crooked smile, the way he used to hum while fixing his bike. She hadn't thought of him in months, not because she didn't care, but because thinking of him meant remembering he might never come back. Her vision blurred. She lowered her head and let the tears fall silently onto her tray, unnoticed by most, ignored by those who saw. She didn't sob. She didn't shake. She simply let the song move through her like a storm, not destroying, but washing, cleaning out a grief she had locked away for too long. When the song ended, the silence felt heavier than before. Frieda wiped her cheeks with her sleeve and straightened her posture. She didn't look around. She didn't want sympathy. She just wanted to hold on to what the music had done, what it had revealed. There was still something human inside her, something that could ache and remember and feel warmth even in the coldest place. Later, in the barracks, she whispered the tune under her breath, careful not to let anyone hear. She still didn't know the woman's name, or what country she came from, or what she had lost to sing like that. But Frieda understood her completely, and in that strange, quiet way, it made the world feel smaller, less foreign, less cruel. Just for a moment. The first time Clara danced, it didn't look like dancing. It looked like remembering. The record had just begun something lively, full of quick piano and a horn that swung like it had someplace to be. The women were seated, as always, shoulders stiff and postures trained into obedience. But Clara, sitting near the edge of the room, didn't stay seated. She stood up slowly, eyes half closed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. No announcement, no smile, just movement. Her foot began to tap in time with the beat. Then her hip shifted, subtle at first, then more freely. She moved as though her body knew this rhythm before her mind caught up. It wasn't a performance. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't asking for permission. She was simply moving, letting the music pour through her like water through cracks. Some of the women stared, unsure whether to be shocked or jealous. One muttered something sharp in German, a word Frieda didn't catch, but understood well enough by the tone. Another looked away entirely, as if afraid that even watching might infect her with something wild. But Frieda kept her eyes on Clara, barely blinking. She had never seen someone look so alive inside a place meant to keep everyone small. Clara had been a stage dancer before the war, though she rarely spoke of it. Something about ballet and cabaret, cheap stages and hungry crowds. In the camp, she mostly kept quiet, smoothing her hair, folding her clothes with elegance no one else bothered with. But when the music played, something in her transformed. Her arms lifted slightly, fingertips floating like feathers, her shoulders rolled with grace that didn't belong in a prison. The guards didn't stop her. They watched in silence, one of them leaning back in his chair with an unreadable expression. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe admiration, maybe even guilt. No one knew what rules applied anymore. The war was still raging across oceans, but here in this hall, a German woman danced to American jazz under the eyes of American soldiers, and the world didn't end. Frieda didn't move, but her heart did. Watching Clara was like watching a fire in a snowstorm, something alive, fragile, and burning anyway. Clara wasn't trying to escape. She wasn't pretending the barbed wire was gone. She was reminding them all that it hadn't reached everything, that inside each of them, something still pulsed. When the music ended, Clara stopped. She didn't bow, didn't look around for approval. She simply sat back down and folded her hands like nothing had happened. The room remained silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that follows something sacred. Then trays clinked again, forks lifted, but something had changed. A thread had been pulled loose. And Frieda, without realizing it, had started tapping her foot. It began without thinking, just a quiet tap beneath the table, her foot following the rhythm like a second heartbeat. Frieda didn't even notice it at first. The music had begun like usual, some upbeat swing number that snapped and bounced with too much joy for a room full of prisoners. But it found her anyway. Through the noise of trays and the weight of war, it slipped under her skin and asked her to feel again. And this time, she let it. Clara glanced over and smiled, just a flicker at the corner of her mouth, nothing loud. She had noticed the movement, but she didn't say a word. No one did. Maybe they all felt it, this strange thaw happening in the middle of an American winter. Frieda's shoulders loosened. Her breath came easier. Her fingers, once always clenched, now rested soft against the edge of her tray. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't surrender either. It was something quieter. A decision, made somewhere deep inside, to allow the moment to exist. The music didn't care where she came from. It didn't demand allegiance or apology. It just played. And in return, it offered something Frieda hadn't felt in months: permission to be a person again, not just a number in a file or a body behind a fence. After the meal, she stepped outside. The air was sharp, but not cruel. The sun had dipped low, casting everything in a soft amber glow. A few women lingered near the fence line, whispering in pairs. Others walked slowly, their arms folded, heads down. Frieda stood alone near the edge of the barracks and looked up at the sky. The same sky that hung over Hamburg, over Berlin, over everything she had lost. It looked different here, wider, somehow, quieter. Inside, someone had left the record spinning. The notes drifted faintly through the walls, muffled but still alive. Frieda swayed, just slightly. Her hands stayed at her sides, her boots grounded in the red dirt. But her body knew what it was doing. The rhythm echoed in her ribs. She thought of home, of her mother's voice, of windows left open in summer, of warm light on kitchen tiles. She thought of who she had been before uniforms and orders and ships that crossed oceans. That girl was still in there, maybe smaller now, maybe bruised, but not gone. The music faded, the final note stretching like a breath held too long. Frieda didn't move for a moment. Then she smiled, just a little, at no one in particular. A quiet, secret kind of smile, not because things were better, not because she was free, but because for a few minutes she had remembered that she was still alive. The woman arrived without warning, white gloves, sharp chin, eyes that scanned the camp like she'd stepped into a filthy kitchen. She introduced herself to the guards as the wife of a local pastor, said she'd come to offer spiritual encouragement to the girls. The guards exchanged a look but didn't argue. Visitors like her were rare, and polite hostility was easier to manage than curiosity. She walked through the barracks with tight lips and folded hands, her heels clicking too loud against the wooden floor. Frieda watched her from her cot, sitting up straight as the woman passed, her perfume leaving a trail of lilac and starch. Some of the women nodded. A few turned away. Clara didn't bother to hide her smirk. But it wasn't until the mess hall that things shifted. The woman stepped inside just as the record began, another Ella Fitzgerald tune, light and warm, with lyrics that melted into melody, like cream into coffee. Frieda had only just settled into the sound, letting it carry her from her tray of overcooked beans, when she heard the sharp intake of breath behind her. "What is that?" the pastor's wife demanded. One of the guards looked up from his corner and shrugged. Music. She walked toward the speaker like it had insulted her personally. "That is not music. That is filth." The room had gone silent. Even the women who didn't understand her English felt the shift in air, the cold edge of a storm rolling in. "You're playing that kind of music for them?" she said, eyes narrowing. "Do you know what this is? It's jungle noise, godless, savage nonsense. This is what they play in nightclubs, in brothels. And now in a camp full of war criminals." Frieda didn't move, but her heart pounded in her chest. Clara leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes bright with defiance. No one answered. The woman turned to the guard again. "My husband buried boys who died fighting these women's brothers, and now you're teaching them how to snap their fingers?" The young soldier stood up slowly, not aggressive, but steady. "Ma'am, I fought in Italy, lost friends too. This music," he glanced at the speaker, "this music got us through. So, yeah, I play it for them. Because maybe they need something to get through too." The pastor's wife went quiet, her mouth pressed into a line. Then she spun on her heel and walked out, her shoes hitting the floor like gunshots. No one said a word for a long time. Then, from the speaker, the record played on unbothered, unashamed. Frieda looked down at her hands and felt the strangest thing. Not fear, not shame, something sharper, pride, not in herself, not yet, but in the sound that refused to be silenced. At night, when the barracks quieted and the last light flickered out, Frieda began to write letters she knew would never be sent. There was no paper rationed for prisoners, no stamps, no addresses she could trust. But she wrote anyway, on scraps of old packaging, on the backs of Red Cross forms, sometimes just in her mind. The act was enough. It gave her somewhere to put the parts of herself she was afraid to lose. She started with her brother. "Eric," she wrote, "do you remember the time we snuck onto the roof to watch the fireworks?" Her hand trembled, though the memory was soft. "You had licorice in your pocket. We thought we were kings." She told him about the camp, about the food, about the guards who watched but rarely spoke. And then she told him about the music. "You would have hated it at first," she admitted, "but I think you would have listened anyway. I think you would have come around." The next letter was to her mother. That one was harder. "Muti, I still hear your singing when I close my eyes. Do you remember the old radio in the kitchen?" She described the American records as best she could, said the voices were full of smoke and sugar, that the notes didn't follow any order she knew, but somehow still made sense. She wrote that sometimes, in the mess hall, she forgot where she was, just for a few minutes, and that she didn't know whether to feel guilty or grateful. She folded each letter carefully, even if there was nowhere to send them. She tucked them under her thin mattress like prayers, words that might one day find a way to reach their intended hands. One night, Clara caught her writing by candle stub and didn't say a word. She just sat down nearby, humming softly to herself, a tune Frieda recognized from that morning's record. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Something had shifted between them, something quiet and deep and shared. A knowing that they were not only surviving, but remembering. Frieda thought about what would happen after the war, if after ever came. Would she go back to sewing? Would the world want her? Would she even recognize it? She wasn't sure. But she knew one thing now with absolute clarity. When she returned, if she returned, she would not leave music behind. The next morning, she found a fresh scrap of paper beneath her plate in the mess hall, a corner of packaging with blank space. No name, no note, just a gift. She looked across the room and caught Clara's eye. A small nod passed between them. Frieda picked up her pencil. There was still more to write. It was Christmas Eve when the record player returned. No announcements, no speeches. Just the low crackle of the needles sliding into place as the women gathered in the mess hall, bundled in mismatched coats and donated scarves. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and something sweet. Perhaps the guards had asked the kitchen to do something different, though the portions were still small and the coffee still weak. No one expected much, and yet there was a strange hush in the room, as if something sacred had entered alongside the steam rising from the trays. Frieda sat at the edge of the table, hands clasped, not from piety, but habit. Around her, the usual silence hung thick, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the kind that waits for music. Then, soft and slow, the first notes of Let It Snow drifted from the speaker. The voice was light, cheerful, the kind that could coax warmth from stone. It wasn't reverent, it wasn't solemn. It was playful, almost teasing, as if the singer had never known hunger or war or wire fences. The room didn't quite know what to do with it. Frieda glanced around. Some women raised their eyebrows. A few stifled small laughs. And then, without meaning to, someone sang. It wasn't loud, just a quiet echo of the chorus. Off-key, broken English, but real. The woman flushed and lowered her head. But the silence didn't return. Another voice joined in, then another. Soon, a thin thread of song wove through the room, not strong, but present. Clara tapped her spoon gently in rhythm. One of the younger girls clapped once, awkwardly, and then laughed a short burst of sound so out of place it felt like thunder. Frieda didn't sing, but she smiled. She let the music wash over her, let the strange lyrics and strange language and strange warmth settle into her chest. She thought of snow, of real snow, falling softly outside their old apartment in Hamburg. She thought of candles on windowsills and her mother's hands dusted with flour. Not perfect memories, not untouched by war, but whole in their own way. The song played to the end. No applause followed, only the soft shuffle of chairs and the sound of breath. But something lingered, something light, as if the music had opened a window just wide enough to let hope in. Later, as they filed out, one of the guards nodded toward Frieda and said quietly, "Merry Christmas." The words startled her. She hadn't heard them in years, but she nodded back. And this time, she meant it. In her bunk that night, wrapped in an old army blanket, she mouthed the words she could remember. Not for anyone else, not for escape, just to keep the music alive a little longer in her heart. Years later, long after the war had ended and the uniforms were folded away into boxes no one opened, Frieda sat in a small apartment in Munich with a record turning slowly beneath the needle. The room was quiet, except for the soft pop and hiss of the vinyl, followed by a voice low, warm, aching in all the same ways it had once been when she was a girl behind wire. Billie Holiday, the same song that had once broken her open in that cold Louisiana mess hall. Now it filled her kitchen like sunlight through lace curtains. On the windowsill sat a photo of her granddaughter playing the piano, eyes closed, lost in her own rhythm. Frieda smiled faintly. The war never made it into her lullabies. Not directly. She never told the child about Camp Ruston, or the wooden beds, or the guards who looked away when tears came. But she had played her music, and in some quiet, invisible way, the stories lived in that. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of yellowed paper, old creased letters, never mailed. The handwriting was smaller now, more fragile, but still hers. She unfolded one and read the line that had come back to her again and again through the years. "You would have hated it at first, but I think you would have listened anyway." She had thought the camp would change her by force, that the guards or the distance from home would crush her into someone else. But it wasn't barbed wire or rations that rewrote her. It was something gentler, something no one expected. The Americans didn't feed her lectures. They fed her jazz. She turned up the volume, letting the trumpet rise, the piano run wild for a moment. It still made her heart catch in her throat, not from sadness, not anymore, but from memory. From the way a single melody could reach across time and tell you that you had survived something worth remembering. Outside, the street was alive with the usual clamor of modern life, cars, footsteps, laughter. But inside, Frieda let the music swell, let herself be still. And in that stillness, she remembered who she had been, a seamstress, a prisoner, a girl who cried into her tray while a song played overhead, a woman who walked away from war with nothing in her hands but everything in her soul. She whispered almost to herself, "It was just music." Then, after a beat, added, "But it saved me." And if anyone had asked how, she would have told them the truth, because sometimes freedom doesn't come with keys or gates. Sometimes it comes on a scratchy record played too loud in a mess hall full of silence. Subscribe to hear more untold stories from World War II, not just the battles, but the quiet rebellions, the unexpected kindnesses, and the music that helped people survive what history forgot.